So, today I wanted to begin our examination of mating behaviors and the evolved psychological mechanisms that surround these mating behaviors. And of course, these are of primary interest to us because, as all of evolutionary theory is based on this premise of reproduction, it should really come as no surprise that topics related to sex and the mating behaviors that surround it occupy not just a central interest to evolutionary psychology as a field, but also to most humans in our personal lives. And I presume it would also occupy central interest to most non-humans as well, at least the non-human species that reproduce sexually, but it's a little harder to ask them directly than it is to ask other people. And as we're going to see later on, this topic can sometimes be a very difficult one to discuss, owing to a lot of the moralization that surrounds the topic of sex. And this is because, as we're going to see, and no doubt some of you already know, sex and the mating activity that surrounds sex, all the behaviors associated with sex, from finding a mate to eventually copulating and raising children, all these behaviors carry a great many costs and benefits for different parties. And these costs and benefits often entail zero-sum contexts. Zero-sum means you have an interaction between two parties, and if one of them is gaining, the other one is losing. So a lot of the sex and mating behaviors are zero-sum contexts. As an example, if we were to discuss something like vision, your ability to see the world doesn't usually negative or positively impact my ability to see the world. But sex is quite a different topic. A partner that's having sex with you or in a relationship with someone else is often unable to commit to that same relationship to a different party or to have sex with a different party. And partners that have entered into a committed relationship with this expectation of monogamy may occasionally stray for an affair, they may abandon their partner entirely, and they inflict costs on them in the process. So the things that are in your best interests from a reproductive mating point of view, from sex and reproduction, these are often not in the best interests of other people, as evidenced by evolution itself, evolutionary theory, focusing on differential reproduction. That is, the fact that not all organisms reproduce exactly the same amount. Some don't reproduce at all, some reproduce far more than others. It's the very engine of evolution itself, differential reproduction, but my success in that domain often can mean your lack of success in that domain. And indeed, as we noted early on in these lectures, evolutionary theory is not about survival per se. It's not about survival of the fittest, despite that constant misnomer. Because nothing survives really. Death as an outcome is a constant for all living things that we know of. Everything that's alive will eventually be dead. But not everything is going to eventually reproduce, and not everything is going to reproduce an equal amount. So if you have an organism that lives to be 10,000 years old, and it's perpetually healthy, and it's perpetually happy, it would still have a lower direct fitness than a different organism that only lived to be 5 years old, but it reproduced regularly. If you take that pattern, live for 5 years under awful conditions but reproduce, versus live 10,000 years under fantastic conditions and never reproduce, if you stretch that out over a long enough period of time, what you end up with in future generations is the happy, healthy, long-lived organisms no longer exist, and the shorter, miserable ones that do reproduce come to predominate throughout the population. Eventually, the shorter-lived ones would be the only things represented, and the happy, healthy ones that lived forever would no longer be there. So whatever positive traits contribute to the survival and happiness of this particular organism, they would not be represented in future generations. Survival, in this sense, is only of interest to the evolutionary process indirectly. Specifically, it's only survival that improves the reproductive fitness of the organism that counts. Specifically, the inclusive fitness, as we discussed last time. Inclusive fitness being how your behaviors affect other copies of your bodies that carry similar genes. So if I reproduce myself, I copy my genes, that increases my inclusive fitness. If I help out my brother and my brother carries copies of genes that are found in my body, this also improves my inclusive fitness. Survival is only useful to the evolutionary process to the extent that it is improving inclusive fitness. If being alive longer actually led to reductions in your inclusive fitness, traits that encouraged survival would be selected against. So the organisms here, these aren't the things getting reproduced after all. It's only the genetic information in these organisms that is getting reproduced. And so as we've seen in the case of the peacock's tail feathers in our previous discussions, evolution can sometimes select for traits that are deleterious to the survival of the organism in the process, or rather in the service of improving its reproductive output. It's bad for the peacock to have very long tail feathers for its survival, but it's good at increasing its mating opportunities. And we see another example of that here. This is a certain species of marsupial that I believe you find in a couple rare places in Australia. During the mating season, there is a 100% fatality rate for males, because the males really basically release endogenous steroids, I believe, during mating season, and they really jack up their body, and they spend all their time invested in mating effort, and this mating effort is so extreme that at the end of the mating season, all the males die. And as you can see there, it's a great example of evolution not being about survival, but rather being about reproduction. In some cases, you can trade off survival for reproduction. So I'm reviewing all this information now to make the central importance of mating clear. For organisms that reproduce sexually, mating and all the things that surround it is sometimes actually more important than being alive. And we also see this, I believe, in salmon. I believe salmon, after they swim upstream and lay their eggs and reproduce, fertilize the eggs, they die. The reproduction is all that matters. It's not the survival. So it's no wonder, of course, that mating attracts a great deal of our psychological attention. Since reproduction and mating behaviors in psychology, by extension, are more important than being alive, in the literal sense. If the mating behaviors of other organisms begin to interfere with mine, well, then it's understandable why we start to have very strong opinions about things like sex and reproduction. And these can turn hostile, or at the very least, uncomfortable. So by word of caution here, before we begin discussing this, I want to stress that in our examination of sex and mating behaviors, understanding and explaining the rationale behind why we do what we do is by no means going to be a justification or a condemnation of these behaviors. We're just trying to look at what happens and why it happens. Just because it's natural, just because it occurs, it doesn't mean it's desirable. And just because you desire something, it doesn't mean it's actually going to occur. We don't want to be committing what you would call the naturalistic fallacy, which is to say because something is natural, it's good. Murder is plenty natural and it's bad. Plants produce toxins and those are perfectly natural. So we want to avoid doing that as best we can. Even though I understand this caution might not really make this sink in given the strength of opinions about these behaviors, it's still worth noting. So with that caution in mind, let's jump into our first topic, which is sex differences. Differences that you will see between males and females. And in many species which develop into male or female, though not necessarily all species, you can observe during the typical course of their development and the eventual phenotypes for each sex that the males and females differ across a wide variety of possible traits. Indeed, as we just talked about and reviewed, you have male peacocks that develop these large ornate tail feathers, and the females of the species don't. You can also see similar things in species like deer, where the males develop a large set of antlers and the females don't. In other species, it's one sex, typically the male, that's going to grow larger and stronger than the female. And this is certainly the case for humans. Human males tend to be taller and more muscular than human females. Human males tend to develop facial hair, tend to develop body hair in amounts that females tend to not. So there are other, of course, readily observable traits, sex differences that no one really argues about, which is perhaps the sex organs. So in the case of humans and other mammals, males have a penis and testicles, females have a vagina, uterus, and ovaries. This isn't the case in every species. For instance, birds often have what you call cloacas, which is kind of a multi-purpose, basically good for excreting waste and mating organ. And I believe they do tend to share that. But you do often see these sex differences in terms of reproductive anatomy itself. And you can also look at things like traits like height, body hair, the presence of mammary glands, bodily fat distributions, and a great many other traits among a great many other species. And we don't need to go through all of them to document each individual one. Just suffice it to say that the sexes differ sometimes and in some ways, though not always and not in all ways. Sex differences do exist for some things and not for others, and sometimes they're more common or more extreme, depending on the species you're talking about. And making sense of all this variation, when it does and doesn't exist, and what specific forms that it can take, if you want to make sense of all of this variation, it can be made substantially easier with a few guiding principles, chief among which is this. The presence of sex differences in physical traits implies the presence of sex differences in evolved psychological mechanisms. That is, if you see one species where there's a consistent sex difference in height between males and females, that's usually the case that it's also associated with some psychological differences between males and females. You can think about it this way. If males and females had to solve identical adaptive problems, then selection would be unable to create any stable sex difference in a physical trait. So, that is, if both males and females have to tackle this identical set of adaptive challenges when it comes to reproduction, what value could it possibly be for, say, males to be taller than females, or females to be more muscular than males? The only way that could be established if the sexes were facing an exactly identical set of challenges would be for completely arbitrary reasons. So without any sex-specific selective pressures, it would be a remarkably unlikely chance occurrence that these physical sex differences emerge and be maintained in so many species for apparently no reason. It would be so remarkable, in fact, that the probability of that happening would be like the classic creationist example of a tornado that blows through a junkyard and just happens to assemble a fully functioning car at random. It's so unlikely that it's basically deemed impossible. And the same thing can be said of physical differences in bodies. If males and females face adaptive challenges that are exactly the same, and there's no pressure selecting for one sex to differ from the other, if sexes do differ, it would have to be the most unlikely chance occurrence you've ever seen possible. Really, the only way that sex-specific physical traits, like height difference or body hair or any of these developmental tendencies could be reliably spread and maintained in a population would be if each sex consistently faced some adaptive problems that are more unique to their sex. And accordingly, they could gain an adaptive benefit from behaving differently. And behavior is really the key here. Because after all, if you aren't going to be behaving differently, then even something as simple as a physical difference in height would be irrelevant. You're not going to get males taller than females if males aren't consistently behaving in ways where being taller is useful in some capacity. You need these differences to be meaningful behaviorally. And as psychology is the thing that generates behavior, the presence of physical differences between the sexes readily implies, at least to some degree, the presence of evolved sexual differences in psychology. Different psychologies for males and different psychologies for females. And so to deny that these sex differences exist in psychology, as some people do, is basically trying to deny that all readily observable sex differences we see in physical traits matter. To deny that there are sex-specific psychological mechanisms is like trying to say it's just a coincidence that across a variety of species you see these incredibly stable sex differences. It's a nonsensical argument to the extreme, though many people don't realize it is that way. Now, that's not to say that there are also a great many things that the sexes do not tend to differ on. Males and females do not tend to differ in the number of eyes they have, on the presence of the bones in their body or the organs that they have, or the experience of tasting sugar and experiencing that as sweet. And this is the exact same principle we see operating between species as well. When different species have to solve different adaptive problems, they often arrive at different solutions. They have different bodies, they have different behaviors, they have different psychologies. But when different species have to solve the same problem, they often tend to develop very similar solutions to this. Lots of species have to solve the problem of vision, so lots of species have eyes. Species that don't have eyes anymore tend to be ones that maybe live underground and don't experience sunlight. And in those species, you do in fact see that during development, they develop eyes, and then they basically stop developing the eyes and reabsorb them, for lack of a better word. Different adaptive challenges between species mean different adaptive solutions. The same adaptive challenges between species usually mean the same adaptive solutions. And this works within a species as well. So when you see males that are facing different problems than females typically, you get different male-female bodies and psychologies. And when you see males and females facing the same adaptive problems, you see males and females developing very similar bodies and psychologies. And we're also going to see that it's not sex per se that determines these differences. It's the adaptive challenges that the sexes face. That is, there are a number of cases in this world where typical sex differences, like in humans, males are taller than females. This is fairly common throughout a lot of different species. But there are instances where this typical sex differences gets reversed, and the female of the species ends up larger and stronger than the males. Or they develop ornamentations, like how deer develop horns if they're male. Sometimes you can flip this and the female will develop these ornaments, and they will fight over males. So now that we know that these physical differences and physical similarities imply differences and similarities in psychology, we want a guiding principle also to help us make sense of all this different variation between species and within species. So we want to think about what adaptive problems might be more unique to one sex or the other, and think about how these problems are solved, including the development of different bodies, the development of different minds, and the deployment of different behaviors. So one great place to start our understanding of why these differences exist and how to make sense of all these is what's known as parental investment theory. This was originated by a researcher called Robert Trivers. And parental investment here is defined by any investment in terms of time, energy, risk, any costly investment that a parent makes with the intended result of improving the chances that their offspring is going to survive or be generally successful in life. That is a transfer of resources from parents to offspring, an investment of resources from parents to offspring. And we're going to start with an example of human reproduction to make this idea clear, since most of us should already be at least familiar with the basics of how humans tend to reproduce. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by thinking about the minimum possible prerequisites to reproduce successfully. The requirements, what you would call obligate parental investments. So how much do human parents need to invest on a minimum required level to produce an offspring to the point that this offspring survives and becomes self-sufficient? Now, exactly what point an offspring does become self-sufficient is up for debate and is going to vary a lot between species. You can just fill in your own blank right now. Sometimes you might want to think about until the child can move around the world on its own, or the child has grown into adulthood and reached reproductive viability. Just whatever, what is the minimum investment each parent needs to make to get the child from not existing to that point in humans? The point where the offspring is no longer dependent on the parents for protection and provisioning. So in humans, this process begins with males producing sperm and females producing an egg. And as a bit of trivia, this is a useful bit of information to know, the production of these sex cells is often what is used to biologically define male or female. That is, the sex that produces the smaller gametes, gametes are sex cells, sperm and egg are gametes, the one that produces the smaller sex cells is often referred to as the male, and the one that produces the larger gametes, in this case the egg, is the female. Sperm are much smaller than eggs, so I'm a male, I produce sperm, and females are the ones that produce the larger eggs. So when it comes to reproduction in humans, males produce a certain amount of sperm and seminal fluid for that sperm. That's what makes up semen, sperm and a chemical cocktail that they're floating in. That's what the male will ejaculate, and the female will produce a mature egg capable of being fertilized. Then the male and female need to locate each other. They need to have sex. Copulate is the scientific term for this, if you want. And when they're finding each other and they're having sex, they need to expend whatever energy is needed in terms of investment for time to find each other, energy to have the sex, exposure to possible risks, like you're having sex and a bear jumps out. You got to be careful about that. When you're having sex, you're not searching for food. So male and female have to endure a certain number of time and risk investments to successfully reproduce. Now, so far, things are looking about even. Both male and female produce their sex cells, the sperm and the egg, the gametes. Both of them engage in this copulation. Then, in humans, if the copulation leads to fertilization of the egg, this egg will implant itself inside the uterus of the female and start growing and dividing until it's going to develop into a viable child. And in humans, this process takes about 9 months. During that process, the developing offspring is going to require nutrients to grow, and those come exclusively from the mother's body. And as this offspring grows, it's also going to impede the mother's ability to move around the world, given the relative size of the offspring and the body of the mother. And also, as we saw previously when we were discussing morning sickness several lectures ago, the needs of this developing offspring may also begin to conflict with the needs of the mother. This exposes her to certain complications and risks that she wouldn't be prone to if she didn't become pregnant. And in some cases, the complications of this pregnancy can be so extreme, they actually do lead to the death of the mother. And further, because this infant is growing inside the body of the mother, this creates a new cost for the mother, because now this precludes her ability to get pregnant again during that same period. This is what we call an opportunity cost. That is, when the mother is pregnant, she's giving up the opportunity to become pregnant again. And so following this approximate 9-month developmental period of energy investment, complications, risk, and loss of possible reproductive opportunities by the mothers then need to give birth. And giving birth is Also, potentially a harmful, risky endeavor, especially in humans, where this can also sometimes lead to the death of the mother. But that's not even where the story ends. As human children are born extremely needy, unable to start caring for themselves when they pop out of mom, they're going to require relatively constant attention and care. You have to protect this infant from being killed by things in the environment. You have to feed this infant so it doesn't starve. It requires constant protection and provisioning. And as we've discussed before, this is where the breastfeeding comes into play. In the environments where human evolved, for most of our species history, there was no such thing as baby formula. You can't just run down to the store and pick up some food for your baby. And this means that the sustenance that the baby is going to require is going to be also still provided by the mother. This is going to be the breastfeeding that she's going to have to engage in. And this entails not just a metabolic cost to the mother for producing the milk and the time cost in sitting there and delivering it to her offspring consistently, but also breastfeeding actually carries more opportunity costs for mating. A lot of people might not know this, but in humans, breastfeeding is associated with a lack of ovulation. That is, breastfeeding is a very effective form of natural birth control. When women are breastfeeding, they are substantially less likely to get pregnant again. Some data reported from studies done in hunter-gatherer societies, some of the few of those that remain, have reported that this period of infertility induced by breastfeeding can last between several months to several years. It depends on a lot of factors. But the point is, when a mother is breastfeeding her infant for several years, she may not be able to become pregnant again. Now, this, of course, makes a certain biological sense, given the neediness of the offspring. It can be hard enough to meet the nutritional needs of a single child, as well as protecting it and generally keeping it safe and alive. And a second pregnancy, at the same time that you are breastfeeding, could pose too large of a burden on the mother's body. You might be trying to split your investment between too many offspring at the same time, and you end up with none of them being successful, as opposed to if you devote all your time and energy into a single one to keep it alive and keep it thriving. So while that might be a very efficient way of allocating the mother's resources, if you're pregnant, you can't get pregnant again, and if you're breastfeeding, you're very unlikely to get pregnant again, this is an efficient way of allocating the resources and keeping the baby alive, but it also raises the possibility of the opportunity costs that the mother is enduring, which is another period where she is unable to successfully reproduce again. So notwithstanding any additional costs, if we just stop there at the point where the mother is going to stop breastfeeding her infant, we can see that when it comes to producing a new human offspring, at this minimum required level, there are massive differences in the costs that males and females have to endure. It starts off at the very basic stages relatively equal. Both males and females are producing their gametes, and both have sex. But at that point, this is where the male's minimum reproductive investment ends. The female's required investment then goes on to include another 9 months of pregnancy, during which she invests substantial caloric resources continuously into the offspring and endures costs to her daily life, and then continues to endure those costs for several years post-birth, during which she can't become pregnant again. All in all, for a female in humans, producing a child would typically result in an investment of about 3 or 4 years of time. And during this time, the male can go out and get as many women pregnant as he wants and doesn't suffer these costs. So given this incredibly unequal required minimum investment on the part of the biological mother and the biological father, it becomes clear that, at least in humans and many other species, males and females are going to face some divergent adaptive problems and differences in reproductive best interests. So a male's minimum investment, if you want to boil this down, a male's minimum investment in producing an offspring can last about 3 minutes, and a female's minimum effort can last about 3 years. 3 years, 3 minutes, you can start to see that there might be some adaptive differences in best interests here. So the degree of parental investment, both required by each sex, as well as what they provide above and beyond what is required at the minimum, are the keys to understanding parental investment theory. And this theory states that the parent which provides more investment in offspring over the course of that offspring's life, the sex that's providing more parental investment will tend to be more selective when it comes to mating choices. So when males provide less investment than females, it should be the females that end up more selective about their mating preferences. Because the costs to making a bad decision for females are substantially higher than the costs for males for making a reproductive decision. And when females are providing less parental investment than males, we should expect that this pattern reverses, where males are going to become the more selective sex when it comes to their mating choices. And then, of course, there's the event where both sexes provide a roughly equal amount of parental investment, and both sexes end up about as selective as their partner. And you can see here, we got some visualized data from Tinder that kind of makes this point a little clear, where 95% of the people that women see on Tinder they pass on, whereas over half the people that men see they give a like to, but they often don't receive a like in return. You can see the impact of parental investment theory here. So this theory can help us frame our discussion of evolved psychological mechanisms that generate preferences and behaviors related to sexually reproducing species across all of the animal kingdom. And this is something I really want to highlight. The importance of evolutionary theory here is that parental investment theory applies to every species. If you have a lot of psychological theories in your standard normal psychology courses, where people talk about self-esteem, or patriarchy, or societal factors, or childhood trauma, whatever they're talking about, most of these theories are not something you would use to describe the behavior of birds, or pigs, or fish. Whereas parental investment theory is something you can actually use for every single species. That gives you a good hint as to which of these tends to be the more useful and probably the more accurate way of understanding the world. So there are key problems here that both sexes need to solve when it comes to making these important mating decisions that depend on the cost and benefits that they face, and how these costs and benefits might shift based on the context, based on what they offer, and based on what they want. So let's start with a very basic scenario here. Let's say you have a species in which males and females face a human typical distribution of parental investment requirements, where the females are going to invest far, far more than the males. This is an imaginary species. And further, this imaginary species lives their life otherwise solitary. The males and females only come together to mate, and then they never see each other again. So in this scenario, the only thing the partners are getting from each other are their genes. In this case, the genes are staying in the mother, and the father is giving the mother his half of the genetic material for the offspring. Since the females, in this hypothetical example, are going to bear the burdens of the reproduction almost exclusively, what can we predict about what each sex would prefer? Well, in terms of the females, we should expect that what they want, metaphorically, of course, is to get the best genes available, whatever best means in this context, because the genes are the only things they're getting. So females should be looking to mate preferentially with the males most likely to provide them with genes that result in healthy, viable offspring. In other words, you would expect that the females are going to value mate quality, the females want to find the best mates that they can find, or rather the best mate that they can find. Males, on the other hand, should prioritize mate quantity. Since males are doing very little to actually provide for the offspring, they're basically just providing their semen and a few seconds to a few minutes of time relating to having sex to produce an offspring. Every possible mating opportunity for a male represents this adaptive jackpot where you can reproduce at a very, very minimal cost to yourself, while another individual bears almost all the costs of it. The only real upper bound on the male's reproductive success in this hypothetical situation would be the number of females he's capable of mating with. So if males that mate with multiple females will produce more offspring than those that don't, but this doesn't hold true for females. If the females have sex with 10 men, she can produce the same number of offspring than if she has sex with one. Whereas for males, if they have sex with 10 females, they could produce 10 times as many offspring as having sex with one. So in this imaginary example here, you should see that males prioritize quantity and females prioritize quality. And this has been demonstrated empirically as well. In a simple experiment back around 1950, they were examining the mating behavior of flies. And so what they did is they made several enclosures, and in each of these enclosures, they had 5 adult males and 5 adult females. And none of the flies had any previous sexual experience. They're virgins. 5 male virgins, 5 female virgins. And the goal was to use genetic markers to track the reproductive success of each male and each female in these enclosures. And what they found is that not all the males were equally successful reproductively. And the male reproductive success was varying substantially more than the females. So when it came to leaving behind any offspring, 21% of the males, they failed to copulate at all. About 1 in 5 of the males failed to have any intercourse, and thus left behind no offspring. Compare that to 4% of the females. 4% of females didn't copulate. So already you can see 4% versus 21%. That's a pretty big difference there. And the difference is even more extreme when you consider of the 4% of females that didn't end up copulating, they were still vigorously courted by the males. The males were trying, the females just didn't go along with it. However, the reproductively successful males often left behind much different numbers of offspring. Specifically, it was reported the most successful males had about 3 times as many offspring as the most successful females. So while most all females reproduced, and not all males did, the males that were successful at reproducing tended to leave behind more offspring than the most reproductively successful females. And as you would expect, male reproductive success increased linearly with the number of partners that they had. The more females a male attracted, the more offspring he produced. And the 21% of the males that failed to attract any mating efforts, this wasn't because they weren't trying, they were just unsuccessful in their courtship attempts. The males were trying to get a partner, they couldn't do it. By contrast, if you had females that were mating with multiple different males, they weren't particularly successful compared to those that mated with few. That is, the female that just mated with a single male was about as successful as the female that mated with 2 males. There was a very, very small difference there. And there was no difference at all if the female mated with 3 or more males. 3+ males left the same amount of offspring as 1 or 2. This just wasn't true for the males. So as expected, the female's ability to produce offspring was not limited by opportunities to find suitors to fertilize her eggs. And the male's reproductive success was not limited by his ability to produce sperm. The male was limited by the quantity of females, and the female was not limited by the quantity of males. So when mating works like this, you can end up with some truly extreme sex differences in bodies, behaviors, and psychologies. And these sex differences are what you would call sexual dimorphism, which just means different bodies. We already saw, of course, one example of this when discussing the peacocks and the peahens. You see the peahen on the right, peacock on the left. So the male on the left is going to develop these brightly colored tail feathers and display them for the females. The females don't develop these. The males tend to gather and compete with one another by displaying the quality of their tails for females, and then they will mate if they are selected by a female, and that's where the male investment ends. So because the males can impregnate a large number of females, there's a good reason to be a successful peacock with a very impressive tail. Not so much for the females. But because the females are investing large portions of parental investment that the males aren't, they end up more selective. The males will mate with just about any female, the females will not mate with just any male. And here we can see another example of this. This is a fun species of mammal called an elephant seal. The male that we see in the middle of the picture can end up growing to sizes about 13 feet long, weigh about 4,500 pounds, compared to the smaller female that you see below. Those tend to grow about 10 feet long, weigh about 1,300 pounds. So why do you have these males that end up about 33% longer and 3.5 times heavier than the females of the species? And this is, of course, because of the differences in their reproductive behaviors. So the way this works is during breeding season, the males arrive at these breeding sites in advance of the females. And the males will compete with one another for access to the largest, most desirable territories. They do this by vocalizing at each other, threatening each other, and if need be, they fight each other. And eventually, a small number of males end up securing the largest, most desirable territories, and they don't tolerate other males being in them. So afterwards, the females arrive, and they tend to gather in groups in these most desirable territories defended by the largest male. And if you have a male here that's successfully defending this large, desirable territory, they can end up with dozens of mating partners while they are engaged in a relatively constant struggle to, in between mating and sleeping, fighting off any other male that comes into their territory and tries to sneak a copulation in there. And this mating effort can be so extreme that the males actually basically fast for months to accomplish this. Because it's a constant task, both mating and defending your territory. They don't have time to go back out to eat. And so they will simply not eat for months. They bulk up for this very specific purpose. And those males that are unable to achieve this success, which is most of the males, they'll be lucky if they get any mating at all done. Most males of this species are completely locked out of the mating game entirely. So you have this world where almost every single female in the species is going to reproduce successfully. But only a very, very small percentage of the males end up being reproductively successful. But if you're a reproductively successful male, you are going to have dozens of reproductive partners. And this can result in very extreme selection for sexual dimorphism, where you end up with males that are 3.5 times the size of the females. Now, in these cases of peacocks and elephant seals, which you can see fighting here, it's clear that the different adaptive problems faced by males and females in this reproductive domain have resulted in selection for massively different bodies. And this is incredibly easy to confirm just by looking at them. However, as we were discussing earlier, it's equally clear that this must have also resulted in the evolution of different psychological preferences as well. And those are harder to see. But it's the male peacocks that are showing off for the females rather than the other way around. It's the male elephant seals that are violently fighting each other for territory rather than the other way around. It's the males that are mating with dozens of females rather than the other way around. And these behaviors tell us about probable psychological differences that should be existing with respect to mating preferences for things like sexual variety. Males probably care about that more than females. Viewing different traits as sexually attractive. Aggressive tendencies, or a desire to show off and display. These are all behaviors created by psychologies. And if you can see a physical difference, you also can infer the presence of a psychological one. And importantly, as I mentioned earlier, this isn't always the exact same way for all the different species. This cost-benefit ratio doesn't end up exactly the same way. You consider this species here that we see called a redneck phalarope. I believe that's how you pronounce it. In this species of bird, it's the females that are larger and more brightly colored than the males. It's like peacocks if you reverse male and female. And in this species, it's the females that fight with each other for access to males, not unlike the elephant seals. So it's the males that are selective. It's the males that are being courted by the females. And it's the males that are the more selective sex here. Now, why might that be? Why do you see this reversal of the sex differences where females are now larger and more aggressive and competing for male attention? Well, if you've been following along with parental investment theory, you can probably predict why this reversal of the typical sex difference exists. And this is because males are the ones that are providing more of the parental investment. So the way it works in this species is when a male and female copulate and the female's eggs are fertilized, she will lay the eggs in the male's nest and then she will leave. And it's the males that provide all the parental investment from incubating the eggs and feeding and protecting the chicks. So while the males rear the eggs, the females can go off and try and find new mates. And because of this, you see a difference that now makes the females larger and more competitive because they are investing substantially less in the reproductive act. And the males now become more selective, just like in humans, the reverse is true. And some similar things happen in other species of pipefish, things like seahorses. In this case, females deposit their eggs into the male, and the male will carry and incubate these eggs internally. And again, we see here that females also begin to become larger and will compete more vigorously for access to males because the male parental investment is larger. So it's the adaptive problems that are being faced by these species that determine the sex difference. If it's the males that are doing more parental investment, they are more selective. If it's the females that are doing more parental investment, it's the females that are more selective. And then other traits which follow this along, like aggression, physical size, interest in displaying in courtship, these follow the predicted pattern along with parental investment. Now, of course, there's another scenario here that we haven't quite focused on yet. So we have cases where males show a much lower rate of parental investment than the females, and so the females are choosier and the males more eager. And we also saw the case where the reverse holds, where females invest less in offspring, and so the males become choosier and the females more eager. So this yields sexual dimorphism, sex difference between the species, whether in terms of physical size or ornamentation and their psychology. So when one sex is investing less in parental effort, they develop the traits that help them compete for access to mates. But then there's this other scenario where both male and female invest approximate equal amounts in parental investment. And many bird species indeed show mating patterns similar to this, where males and females will work together to do things like construct nests, incubate eggs, and protect and provision the chicks after they hatch. These species aren't always completely monogamous, but they do tend to lean much more heavily towards monogamy, and a much more equitable division of labor when it comes to parental investment. And in species where you have an identical amount of parental investment between males and females, well, what should we expect to see with respect to the sex differences? In this case, if parental investment is comparable, we should see a greater convergence between the sexes and a reduction of any sex differences. In fact, if parental investment was truly identical, we really shouldn't expect any sex differences at all, except outside of perhaps in the production of sperm versus egg and the mechanisms you need to do that. And that's because if these sex differences only emerge in response to different adaptive cost-benefit ratios and different adaptive problems faced by males and females, well, if the sexes are facing an identical set of problems, then we shouldn't expect any differences. And so this is really a very useful tool for understanding sex differences within every species that you see out there. The greater the degree of sexual dimorphism, the more the sexes tend to differ from each other, the greater the differences we should expect in their reproductive variability and parental investment. So, if males are much larger than females, this is probably because females are investing far, far less than males are. And if females are larger than males, much larger, this might be because the males are investing less. It all depends on the cost and benefit ratio that the males and females face. So if we see a large difference in sexual dimorphism, we should expect a mating system where one sex is less equal in its distribution of parental efforts. So if you imagine you have a species where males are much larger than females, you might start to expect that a very small percentage of the males are producing most of the offspring. Maybe 5% of the males produce 80% of the future generation. But if there's not much of a difference between males and females, you might expect a more equitable 50-50 distribution, where 50% of males produce about 50% of the offspring. And finally, it's worth noting that, like many instances of life, these mating strategies can be context-specific. That is, a species might generally tend towards monogamy, but there could occasionally be contexts where some of them might pursue mating outside of that monogamous pair bond. And humans indeed seem to be one such species. We engage both in long and short-term mating behaviors. So you have the long-term, more monogamous pair bonds. You have mating that occurs promiscuously across a variety of short-term encounters. And sometimes people will mix and match, where most of their sex could occur within the context of a long-term partner, but occasionally also occur outside the bounds of that relationship. Or they might pursue a short-term mating strategy at one point in their life and a long-term mating strategy in another, depending on which contexts they face. And as I mentioned initially, of course, the topic of sex draws a lot of psychological attention and moralizing for this reason. Not only is reproduction the engine of evolution, the process that shapes our body and minds, but the strategies of others around you that are also engaged in this mating behavior can negatively impact your success. That is, imagine that species we just talked about. You have 5% of the males producing 80% of the offspring. Well, this probably means that the other 90 to 95% of males are all but locked out of the mating game entirely. And so that 5% of males doing almost all the mating, this is bad for about 95% of the other males. And they might have some strong feelings about this. Conversely, if you would be in that 5% of extremely successful males, it doesn't do you any favors if everyone around you is pursuing a monogamous strategy. If you would be very successful if everyone engaged in short-term behavior, well, you don't want them engaging in long-term behavior. This is bad for your interests. Other people's mating decisions have impacts on your success. And so we should expect these individual differences in reproductive best interests to shape a great deal of our perceptions about the morality of sexual behavior, as well as a great many other things that surround it. how we're going to cover later how attitudes towards drug use are actually surprisingly tied to attitudes about sex. We'll get to that in future lectures, but for now it's an interesting point to bear in mind. Now, while we can't give other species surveys or ask them about their psychological preferences, we have to infer their preferences from their behaviors. We're lucky enough to be able to ask humans about their preferences and allow us to explore some facets of evolved mating psychology more easily, if you can just ask people what they're thinking. So, in humans, males and females both provide parental investment, but as we discussed, the minimum investment from females far surpasses the minimum investment for males. And so, in this respect, humans follow a bit of a mixed mating strategy, where male parental investment can be highly variable, ranging from none at all, they have sex and then they're out of the picture, to an amount of investment in the children which rivals or even exceeds that of the mothers in some instances. Male reproductive success often depends on this variable, and it's highly variable at that. Some males invest a lot in parenting, some males invest nothing. And this can create some differences in evolved psychology, specifically with our preferences for providing and receiving parental investment in contextual ways. So it's possible for males to prefer a world where they provide no parental investment, as is the case for a great many mammalian species. Because for a male, each mating opportunity is this jackpot of a fitness payoff, where they can potentially reproduce successfully for very little cost. For females, each mating opportunity represents the same fitness gain, produce as many children, but they suffer a great number of costs for doing so. So we can think about how this might shape male and female preferences for casual sex. So, while this isn't much of a prediction, given that we all know a lot about the preferences that already exist in males and females, we might predict that males are substantially more interested in casual sex than females. That is, when it comes to our lovely little glory hole here, we'd probably see more males that were interested in doing this thing if more females were, but they typically aren't. So with this in mind, let's actually examine how men and women respond to offers for just that. How do men and women respond to offers for casual sex? In a fantastically simple paper from 1989 by two researchers by the name of Clark and Hatfield, they asked about this question quite literally. So what they did in this study, they had 9 Confederates. Confederates are people who are working for the researcher, but the participants in the study don't know that. So these 9 Confederates, they had 5 women and they had 4 men. And these are college-aged Confederates, your average college student. And what they were going to do is these Confederates would approach members of the opposite sex, strangers that they didn't know, around the campus, and they would confront them with some interesting offers. So these Confederates are about 22 years old. They range in attractiveness from slightly below to slightly above average. You know, they're your average college students working for the research. And what these Confederates do, is they're instructed to approach strangers on campus, they don't know these people, that they consider attractive enough that they would actually consider having sex with them given the opportunity in the right context. It's not just go ask anyone, it's go ask someone you might reasonably consider having sex with in some contexts. And the Confederates say the following to these strangers. I've been noticing you around campus. I find you to be very attractive. And after they said that, they would end with one of 3 requests. The first was, would you go out with me tonight? That is, they're requesting a date. Would you come over to my apartment tonight? That is, a request for an encounter with more intimacy and a greater implied probability of sex. Or 3, straight out asking, would you go to bed with me tonight? Would you have sex? So you have a stranger approaching you saying, would you go on a date with me? Would you come back to my apartment with me? Would you have sex with me? how do people respond to this? Well, the results here were fairly striking, and you don't need to know much about statistics to get the picture. So when a male is approaching a female and requesting a date, they were successful about 56% of the time, which frankly, very solid success rate. This was the late 1980s. Perhaps things would look a little different today. But if a strange male approached a strange female, male of average attractiveness, and said, I find you very attractive, I've noticed you around, do you want to go on a date with me? About 56% received an affirmative interest. And when females approached a male, exact reversal of this, they got very similar results. About 50% of the men said, sure, I'll go on a date with you tonight. So males and females in this study didn't really differ in their preference for going on a date. Now, when it came to the request to come back to the apartment tonight, men approaching women got a 6% acceptance rate. So women seemed quite uninterested rather, in going back to a man's apartment. The reverse didn't hold true, though. If a strange woman approached a strange man and said, you want to come back to my apartment tonight? 69% acceptance rate. Over 11 times higher. And the results were even more striking when it came to offers for sex. Every woman that was approached flat out refused the offer. There was a 0% acceptance rate for casual sex. 75% of men accepted this offer from women. So 75% of men said, yeah, of course I'll go to bed with you tonight. But that 75% and 0% doesn't actually paint the full picture. That is, the Confederates were also noting the responses of the people they approached. Not just did they say yes or no, but what did they say? And so when a woman asked a man, would you come back to my apartment tonight? Something a man might say would be, yeah, but why are we waiting for tonight? Let's go right now. Or, I can't do tonight, but tomorrow's good for me. Or, I'd really love to, I'm flattered, but I have a girlfriend. So men that said yes eagerly. And men that said no often said no in an apologetic sort of way. Thanks, but I can't. I'd love to, but I'm busy. Women had a little bit of a different take on the matter. That was when a strange man approached a woman and requested a sexual encounter, the responses they got were similar to like, you've got to be kidding me. What's wrong with you? Who do you think you are? Who do you think I am? The women weren't just saying no. The women were saying hell no. It was offensive. It was disgusting. It was aggressively saying no. And given what we know about the minimum levels of parental investment required, these results really shouldn't come as any surprise. Indeed, if you were to phrase this in terms of cost versus benefit analysis, basically what you're looking at on some level is like somebody approaching you and asking you, do you want $100? Yeah, sure. Or someone approaching you and asking you, is it all right if I punch you in the face? That's kind of what we're getting at here. In one case, when a strange woman is asking a strange man for a cost-free sexual encounter, this is a massive benefit for the man. But when a strange man is asking a woman for a basically benefit-free sexual encounter for her, it's a massive risk and it's a massive cost. And so, what this rather simple study highlights is the importance of something we're going to expand upon more next time, which is the difference between adaptations for short-term and long-term sexual strategies. That is, are you the type of person that wants to engage in relatively long-term monogamous strategies where you are going to highly invest in your partner and offspring, or are you going to pursue a more short-term strategy where you're not going to invest very much in your partner or their offspring? And there are many key differences posed by the challenges of these two different strategies between short and long-term mating in general. And men and women are going to face different sex-specific problems when it comes to solving short versus long-term mating encounters. And the costs and benefits of these strategies are not always going to fall equally on both sexes. However, we do know that both short and long-term sexual encounters have historically been a part of our species' past. After all, if women never engaged in short-term mating behavior, if women truly never engaged in it, there could never be any selective pressure for males to prefer short-term sexual behavior. In order for men to be interested in such a thing consistently, this implies that something similar must have at least occasionally existed. For instance, you couldn't develop a taste for sugar if over the entire span of your species' evolutionary history, you never tasted sugar or anything like it. If you were never ingesting it, there could be no selective pressure for pursuing it. Same thing with mating. If short and long-term mating didn't consistently happen, we wouldn't have psychological preferences for such things. So just as sexual dimorphism in bodies is evidence of sexual dimorphism in brains, evolved preferences for behaviors do imply, at least to some degree, that opportunities for such behaviors probably existed in the past.